The massive doors of the Galactic Council chamber slid open with a soft hiss, revealing the circular room where representatives from 12 different worlds had gathered in emergency session. Admiral Kyle Morrison stepped through the entrance. His black uniform bearing the insignia of the Terran Defense Force, his weathered face showed no emotion as he walked toward the center of the chamber, but his gray eyes held the weight of terrible news. The chamber itself was a marvel of galactic engineering, with each species having their own section designed for their specific needs. The Kreth delegation sat on heated stone platforms, their reptilian bodies requiring warmth to function properly. The insectoid Zephyrians hung from specially designed perches, their multiple eyes tracking every movement in the room. The aquatic Nautilians observed from their water-filled viewing pods. While the energy beings known as the Lumina flickered in their containment fields, Morrison had been in these chambers many times before, but never under such dire circumstances. The Vex Collective had returned after 20 years of silence, and their assault on the outer colonies had been swift and brutal. 3 entire star systems had gone dark in the past 2 weeks, their populations either evacuated or worse. The enemy had learned from their previous defeats and adapted their strategies accordingly. Commander Lisa Hayes stood at Morrison's side, her tablet displaying the latest intelligence reports. She was young for her rank, only 32, but her analytical mind had proven invaluable in understanding alien threat patterns. Her brown hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her green eyes constantly scanned the data flowing across her screen. The numbers were staggering and growing worse by the hour. The Kreth representative, a massive being named Sktar, rose from his heated platform. His scaled hide reflected the chamber's lights as he spoke in his species' hissing language, which the universal translators converted to standard galactic. "The Vex have consumed 3 of our mining worlds," he said, his voice carrying the weight of profound loss. "My people barely escaped with their lives, and those who remained behind were taken for their biomechanical conversion processes." Morrison nodded grimly. The Vex were not content to simply conquer worlds. They harvested everything useful from their victims, converting organic matter into their grotesque war machines and incorporating technology into their ever-growing collective. It was a form of warfare that most galactic species found incomprehensible in its totality. Captain Ben Rodriguez had just arrived from the Kepler sector, his ship docking at the station only hours before the emergency session began. He was a veteran of the border conflicts, his dark hair now streaked with gray despite being only 40 years old. His ship, the Defiant, bore the scars of recent combat, and his crew was exhausted from weeks of running battles with Vex scouts. Rodriguez stepped forward to address the assembly. "The situation in the outer colonies is worse than our initial reports indicated," he said, his voice carrying throughout the chamber. "The Vex aren't just conquering territory. They're consuming entire ecosystems, stripping planets down to their bedrock and converting everything into their bioships. The speed of their advance has increased dramatically since their return." The Zephyrian delegate, a creature whose name roughly translated to swift wing, clicked its mandibles in what humans had learned was their expression of extreme distress. "Our hive colonies on the rim worlds reported strange signals before communications ceased," it said through the translator. "The Vex appear to have developed new methods of disrupting our defensive systems." Dr. Rachel Stone sat in the observation section, her pale face focused on the data streaming across her personal display. She was the xenobiologist who had first cracked the Vex communication codes during the previous war, and her work had been crucial in developing effective countermeasures. Now, at 55, she found herself facing an enemy that had evolved beyond her previous understanding. The intercepted Vex transmissions that Stone had been analyzing told a disturbing story. The enemy was not just confident in their current campaign, but was already planning the division of conquered territory. Their hive mind communications buzzed with anticipation of final victory, discussing the allocation of resources and the conversion of captured populations with the casual efficiency of beings who considered the war already won. Morrison walked to the center of the chamber, his boots echoing on the polished floor. The Vex Collective has learned from their previous defeats, he announced to the assembled delegates. They have adapted their biomechanical technology to counter our defensive measures, and their assault has been coordinated across multiple star systems simultaneously. Our traditional response patterns are proving inadequate. The Nautilin representative, speaking through a water-filled communication device, added its own grim assessment. Our deep space monitoring stations detected massive Vex fleet movements toward the core systems. The enemy appears to be massing for a decisive strike against our industrial worlds. Hayes stepped forward, her tablet displaying tactical projections. Based on current movement patterns, the Vex will reach the core systems within 72 hours, she reported. Their bioships are traveling in formations we've never seen before, suggesting they've developed new collective intelligence protocols. The atmosphere in the chamber grew heavy with despair. The Kreth delegate's scales changed color, a sign of deep emotional distress among his species. The Zephyrin's wings buzzed with nervous energy, while the lumina flickered more rapidly in their containment fields. Even the normally stoic Nautilins seemed agitated, their tentacles moving restlessly in their water-filled pods. Morrison had faced desperate situations before, but this felt different. The Vex had returned with overwhelming force and clear tactical superiority. Their biomechanical ships had proven resistant to conventional weapons, and their ability to adapt and incorporate captured technology made them more dangerous with each victory. Dr. Stone rose from her seat in the observation section. Admiral Morrison, I need to speak with you privately, she said, her voice carrying an urgency that caught his attention. The latest transmissions I've decoded suggest the Vex are not just confident about their current campaign. They're already celebrating what they consider to be their final victory. The chamber fell silent as the implications of her words sank in. The Vex Collective, masters of biological warfare and technological adaptation, believed they had already won. They were treating the remaining battles as mere formalities, discussing the conquest of the galactic core worlds as an accomplished fact. Morrison looked around the chamber at the representatives of 12 different worlds, each one looking to humanity for leadership in this desperate hour. The irony was not lost on him. Humans were the newest members of the galactic community, having achieved faster-than-light travel only 50 years ago. Yet in every previous conflict, human tactical innovation and stubborn refusal to surrender had proven decisive, but this time felt different. The enemy had learned, adapted, and returned with overwhelming force. As Morrison prepared to adjourn the session, he caught sight of a priority message appearing on his personal communicator. The sender was listed as Earth Command, and the message was marked with the highest classification level. Ghost of a smile played across Morrison's weathered features as he read the transmission. Perhaps the enemy was celebrating too soon. 3 days after the emergency session, the worst fears of the Galactic Council became reality. Captain Ben Rodriguez stood on the bridge of the Defiant, watching in horror as massive Vex bioships emerged from hyperspace around the industrial world of New Geneva. The enemy vessels were unlike anything he had encountered before, their organic hulls pulsing with unnatural life while mechanical components jutted from their surfaces like metallic bones. The defending fleet had been waiting for this moment. Human ships from the Terran Defense Force formed the core of the defense, supported by Kreth heavy cruisers and swift Zephyrian interceptors. Rodriguez had hoped their combined firepower would be enough to slow the Vex advance, but the enemy had brought overwhelming numbers to this battle. Lieutenant Commander Paul Brooks, the tactical officer aboard the Defiant, reported the enemy strength from his station. His young face was pale as he read the scanner data. Captain, we're detecting over 300 Vex bioships in the first wave, he said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. Long-range sensors show at least twice that number still emerging from hyperspace. Rodriguez felt his stomach drop. The entire defending fleet consisted of barely 60 ships, and they were facing nearly 1,000 enemy vessels. The math was simple and terrifying. Even if each defending ship destroyed 10 Vex bioships, they would still be overwhelmed by Sheer numbers. The battle began with a coordinated strike from the Galactic fleet. Human plasma torpedoes and Kreth particle beams lanced out across space, finding their targets among the advancing Vex ships. For a brief moment, Rodriguez allowed himself to hope as enemy bioships exploded in brilliant flashes of light. The defenders were fighting with skill and determination, their years of training evident in every maneuver, but the Vex had learned from their previous defeats. As the battle progressed, their bioships began to adapt to the defensive fire. Ships that had been damaged by plasma torpedoes quickly regenerated their organic hulls, while others developed new armor plating that deflected particle beams. The enemy was evolving in real time, becoming more resistant to galactic weapons. With each passing minute, then the Vex deployed their new weapon. Massive spore clouds began to spread from specialized bioships, drifting toward the defending fleet like a green fog of death. Rodriguez watched in growing alarm as the first cloud reached a Kreth cruiser. The ship's lights flickered once, then died completely. The massive vessel began to drift, its engines silent and its weapons offline. Brooks frantically worked at his station, trying to understand what was happening. "Captain, the spore clouds are disrupting all electronic systems," he reported. "Ships caught in the cloud are losing power across all systems. Their crews are trapped inside dead hulls." Rodriguez ordered evasive maneuvers, but the spore clouds were spreading too quickly. One by one, defending ships found themselves engulfed in the green mist. Some tried to ram the nearest Vex bioships in final acts of defiance, but most simply drifted helplessly as enemy boarding pods latched onto their hulls. The Defiant managed to avoid the spore clouds for nearly 2 hours, but the tactical situation was hopeless. For every Vex bioship the defenders destroyed, 2 more emerged from hyperspace. The enemy seemed to have unlimited numbers, and their adaptive technology was making them stronger with each engagement. Rodriguez made the hardest decision of his military career. "All ships, this is Captain Rodriguez," he broadcast on the fleet frequency. "Execute withdrawal protocol. Fall back to the secondary defense line." The words tasted like ash in his mouth, but staying would only result in the complete destruction of the defending fleet. Meanwhile, on the surface of New Geneva, Colonel Amy Turner was fighting her own desperate battle. Her mixed unit of human Marines and Kreth warriors had taken defensive positions around the planet's capital city. The enemy's biomechanical soldiers were unlike anything in the military databases, their forms shifting and adapting as they encountered different types of resistance. Turner crouched behind a barricade made from overturned vehicles, her rifle trained on the approaching enemy. The Vex soldiers moved with unnatural coordination, their organic and mechanical parts working in perfect harmony. When one fell to rifle fire, the others would immediately adapt their tactics. Learning from their fallen comrade's death, Sergeant Jake Miller, her communications specialist, crawled over with the latest updates from other defensive positions. "Colonel, the east side is falling," he reported. "The Vex soldiers are adapting faster than we can change our tactics. They're learning to counter our weapons and predict our movements." Turner had seen this pattern before in the previous war, but never to this degree. The enemy was not just adapting to their weapons, but to their entire way of fighting. Ambush tactics that had worked in the morning were useless by afternoon. Defensive positions that had held for hours were overrun as the Vex learned to exploit every weakness. The battle for the capital lasted 6 hours. Turner's forces fought with incredible bravery, but they were facing an enemy that became more efficient with each engagement. The Vex biomechanical soldiers were not just learning from their mistakes, but sharing that knowledge instantly with every other unit in the field. Finally, with enemy forces surrounding the capital on 3 sides, Turner made the decision to retreat to the mountains. Her remaining forces, less than half of what she had started with, fell back to prepared positions in the rocky terrain. The Vex did not pursue immediately, instead consolidating their control over the captured city. Back at Zentari Prime, Admiral Morrison received the reports from New Geneva with growing dread. The pattern was repeating itself across multiple worlds. The Vex had deployed their new spore weapon against defending fleets while their ground forces demonstrated unprecedented adaptive capabilities. The enemy was winning every engagement, and their victories were becoming easier with each battle. Commander Lisa Hayes brought him the latest intelligence summaries. "Admiral, we're receiving similar reports from all the core systems," she said. "The Vex are advancing on multiple fronts simultaneously. Their bioships are proving resistant to our weapons, and their spore clouds are disabling entire fleets." Morrison studied the tactical displays showing enemy movements across the galaxy. Red markers indicating Vex forces were spreading like a plague across the star maps. The enemy was not just winning but accelerating their advance with each victory. The Galactic Council was in emergency session again, but this time the atmosphere was one of barely controlled panic. The Kreth representative was speaking of complete evacuation of the core worlds. The Zephyrians were discussing retreat to the Rim territories. Even the normally courageous Nautiloans were suggesting a strategic withdrawal to regroup and plan for a prolonged resistance. Dr. Rachel Stone approached Morrison with her latest analysis of intercepted Vex communications. "Admiral, the enemy? Transmissions are becoming more confident," she reported. "They're discussing the final phase of their campaign as if it's already underway. The Vex commanders are dividing up territory and planning the conversion of entire star systems." Morrison felt the weight of command pressing down on him. The Galactic Council was preparing for a complete retreat, abandoning the core worlds to the Vex in hopes of regrouping somewhere beyond the enemy's reach. It was a sound military strategy, but it meant sacrificing billions of lives and the industrial capacity that kept the galactic civilization functioning. Then Morrison made a decision that would have seemed insane to any conventional military strategist. He stood up and addressed the assembled council members. "The Terran Defense Force will not retreat," he announced. "We're establishing a defensive perimeter around the Sol system. Any species that wishes to make a stand with us is welcome to join." The reaction was immediate and shocked. The alien representatives protested that it was suicide to make a stand so deep in human territory when the enemy controlled the space lanes. The Kreth delegate hissed that it was illogical to concentrate forces where they could be easily surrounded. The Zephyrians clicked their mandibles in what humans recognized as their expression of disbelief, but Morrison had received another priority message from Earth Command, and this one contained information that changed everything. The smile that played across his weathered features was not one of despair but of anticipation. The enemy might be celebrating their approaching victory, but humanity had been preparing for this moment longer than anyone realized. Deep beneath the Colorado mountains, Dr. Elizabeth Carter worked in a classified research facility that officially did not exist. The underground complex had been carved from solid rock over the past 2 years, its corridors lined with quantum shielding that blocked all forms of electronic surveillance. Carter had been living in this hidden world for 18 months, leading a project that Earth Command had deemed too dangerous for normal military deployment. The project was called Prometheus Fire, and it represented humanity's most desperate gamble. Carter stood before a massive holographic display showing the complex molecular structure of Vex biomechanical technology. Her team had been studying captured enemy samples since the previous war, searching for weaknesses that conventional weapons could not exploit. The breakthrough had come 6 months ago when Carter realized that the Vex's greatest strength was also their most critical vulnerability. Every Vex unit, from the smallest biomechanical soldier to the largest fleet command ship, was connected through quantum entanglement networks that allowed instant communication across vast distances. This hive mind connection gave them perfect coordination, but also created a single point of failure. Carter's weapon was designed to exploit this weakness. The Prometheus Fire device would generate a quantum disruption pulse that would travel through the Vex network, severing their connections and leaving individual units isolated and confused. The theory was sound, but the practical challenges were enormous. Captain Steve Morgan had been selected as the test pilot for the delivery system after extensive psychological evaluation. He was 38 years old with black hair and calm blue eyes that had seen action in the border conflicts. Morgan possessed the rare combination of technical skill and absolute fearlessness that the mission would require. The delivery system was a modified stealth ship called the Nighthawk, equipped with experimental cloaking technology that could hide it from Vex sensors. The ship was small, fast, and nearly impossible to detect, but it had one critical limitation. The quantum disruption device could only be activated at close range, requiring the Nighthawk to penetrate deep into enemy formations. Morgan studied the mission parameters in Carter's underground laboratory. The plan was audacious beyond belief. A single ship would need to approach the center of the Vex fleet concentration and deploy the weapon while surrounded by thousands of enemy bioships. The survival probability had been calculated at less than 3%. The quantum pulse will spread through their network in microseconds, Carter explained, pointing to the holographic display. Every connected Vex unit will experience immediate disconnection from the hive mind. They'll be isolated, confused, and vulnerable for the first time in their species' history. Morgan nodded, understanding the implications. The Vex had never existed as individuals. They were components of a vast collective consciousness, and suddenly being alone would be more devastating than any conventional weapon. What about the timing? He asked. The pulse will only work if we can get close enough to their command ships, Carter replied. The quantum entanglement networks are strongest at the fleet center, where the hive mind coordinators are located. We need to be within 50 kilometers of their flagship when the device activates. Meanwhile, Admiral Morrison had begun implementing the second phase of humanity's response. Across human space, every colony, outpost, and space station was being evacuated and converted into a weapons platform. The retreating civilian populations were not simply fleeing, but were laying elaborate traps for the advancing enemy. Captain Rodriguez, his ship repaired after the battle at New Geneva, was leading one of these evacuation efforts at the mining colony of Titan's Rest. The colonists had been working for days to prepare their facilities for the Vex arrival, rigging mining equipment to explode, and booby-trapping every useful piece of technology. The plan was based on humanity's deep understanding of Vex behavior. The enemy would consume everything they found, incorporating human technology into their own systems. What they would not realize was that every piece of equipment contained hidden surprises, programmed to activate at specific times or under certain conditions. Rodriguez watched as the last transport ship departed from Titan's Rest, carrying the final group of evacuees to safety. Behind them, they left a colony that appeared to be abandoned but was actually a massive trap. The mining lasers had been rigged to overload, the fusion reactors were set to cascade failure, and every computer system contained dormant viruses. Designed to spread through Vex networks, this pattern was being repeated across dozens of human worlds. The retreating populations were not just abandoning their homes, but were turning them into weapons. It was a strategy that required incredible sacrifice, as entire colonies were being destroyed to deny them to the enemy. Back on Earth, weapons specialist Janet Lewis was making final preparations for the Nighthawk mission. She was 29 years old, with red hair and green eyes that reflected her Irish heritage. Lewis had designed the trigger mechanism for the Prometheus fire device, ensuring it would activate at exactly the right moment. The device itself was about the size of a briefcase, but its power source required most of the Nighthawk's cargo bay. The quantum disruption generator drew enormous amounts of energy, and the ship's entire power grid had been modified to support the weapon. Once activated, the device would drain the ship's batteries completely, leaving the crew with minimal life support. Navigation expert Rick Adams joined Lewis in the final equipment checks. Adams was a quiet man in his early 30s with brown hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He had plotted the course that would take the Nighthawk through the Vex fleet undetected, using gravitational anomalies and sensor shadows to mask their approach. The window will be incredibly narrow, Adams explained to Captain Morgan. We'll have maybe 30 seconds from the time we decloak until the Vex sensors lock onto us. The quantum pulse has to activate during that time, or we'll be destroyed before we can complete the mission. Dr. Carter made one final check of the quantum disruption device. The weapon represented 2 years of theoretical research and practical development, but it had never been tested at full power. The underground facility simply was not large enough to contain a full-scale test, and activating the device on Earth would have catastrophic effects on human electronics. The beauty of this weapon is its simplicity, Carter explained to the assembled team. We're not trying to destroy the Vex ships or disable their technology. We're just cutting the communication lines that hold their collective consciousness together. Without the hive mind connection, they'll panic and turn on each other. The Prometheus Fire project had been developed in absolute secrecy, with only a handful of Earth Command officers aware of its existence. Admiral Morrison had received regular updates on the weapon's progress, but even he did not know all the technical details. The security was necessary because the weapon's effectiveness depended entirely on the element of surprise. As the Vex fleet advanced toward the core systems, humanity's trap was being set. The enemy had consumed dozens of human installations, incorporating their technology and resources into the collective war machine. What they did not know was that every piece of human equipment contained hidden programming that would activate when the quantum pulse was transmitted. The Vex were making the same mistake that had doomed countless civilizations throughout human history. They were underestimating their opponent's capacity for sacrifice and innovation. The enemy commanders, drunk on their recent victories, pressed forward without caution. Convinced that victory was inevitable, Captain Morgan and his crew made their final preparations aboard the Nighthawk. The ship had been painted matte black to reduce its visual signature, and its hull was covered with experimental materials that absorbed sensor radiation. The crew of 6 volunteers had been chosen for their skills and their willingness to undertake what was essentially a suicide mission. The mission would begin when the Vex fleet concentrated for their final assault on Earth. Intelligence reports indicated that the enemy was gathering their forces for a decisive strike against humanity's home system. It would be the perfect opportunity to deploy the Prometheus fire weapon, but the timing had to be exactly right. Dr. Carter watched the final preparations from her command center, knowing that the fate of the galaxy now rested on a single ship and a weapon that had never been tested in combat. The enemy was celebrating their approaching victory, but humanity had prepared one final surprise that would change everything. The Vex celebration reached its peak as their forward scouts transmitted the coordinates of humanity's home system. Earth, the birth world of the species that had caused them so much trouble over the decades, lay within their grasp at last. The hive mind commanders gathered their vast fleets from across the galaxy, pulling ships from occupied worlds to concentrate their forces for what they expected to be a glorious final battle. Captain Steve Morgan watched the enemy fleet assembly. From the bridge of the Nighthawk, his stealth ship hidden in the shadow of a dead moon at the edge of the solar system. For 72 hours, he and his crew had observed the Vex bioships arriving in waves, each group larger than the last. The enemy vessels merged into an ever-growing swarm that darkened the space around Jupiter with their numbers. The sight was both terrifying and exactly what humanity had hoped for. The Vex were making the same mistake that had doomed countless armies throughout human history. They were concentrating their forces in one location, creating a single massive target that could be destroyed with the right weapon at the right moment. Morgan's crew worked quietly at their stations, maintaining the ship's stealth systems while monitoring Vex communications. Weapons specialist Janet Lewis had been tracking the enemy's command structure, identifying the flagship and support vessels that coordinated the hive mind network. Navigation expert Rick Adams continuously updated their approach course, using the gravitational pull of Jupiter's moons to mask their movement. The Vex fleet was unlike anything in recorded galactic history. Over 2,000 bioships had gathered in the outer solar system, their organic hulls pulsing with unnatural life while mechanical components glowed with stored energy. The smallest vessels were the size of human destroyers, while the largest command ships stretched for kilometers and contained the processing power of entire worlds. As the enemy fleet approached Earth's outer defenses, they encountered what appeared to be humanity's last desperate stand. The remaining ships of the Terran Defense Force had formed a defensive line around Mars, their formations spread thin across the planet's orbital path. Admiral Morrison commanded the defense from his flagship, the Valiant, while other human captains prepared their crews for what seemed like a hopeless battle. The human fleet was outnumbered 50-1, but they engaged the Vex with seemingly reckless courage. Captain Rodriguez, his ship, the Defiant, still bearing scars from previous battles, led a squadron of destroyers in a direct assault on the enemy's forward elements. The human ships fired their weapons with desperate intensity, knowing that every shot might be their last. Colonel Amy Turner had returned to space after her ground campaign, now commanding a wing of fighter squadrons that darted between the massive Vex bioships like insects attacking giants. Her pilots flew their small craft with suicidal bravery, targeting the sensor arrays and weapon systems of enemy vessels that could have destroyed them with a single shot. The battle appeared to follow the pattern of previous engagements. Human ships fought with skill and determination, but the Vex bioships absorbed their fire and grew stronger with each exchange. The enemy's adaptive technology allowed them to develop countermeasures in real time, making their hulls more resistant to human weapons and their shields more effective against energy attacks. But this time, the human resistance had a different purpose. Every ship that engaged the enemy was following a carefully planned script, drawing the Vex fleet into a specific formation while keeping their attention focused on the visible threat. The real battle was being fought by a single stealth ship that the enemy could not detect. Morgan guided the Nighthawk through the chaotic battle, using the weapon discharges and sensor interference to mask their approach. The ship moved like a ghost through the enemy formation, its experimental cloaking systems rendering it invisible to Vex sensors. Adams piloted them through gaps in the enemy fleet, following a route that had been calculated to avoid the most sensitive detection equipment. The Vex pressed forward with overwhelming confidence, their bioships consuming disabled human vessels and incorporating their technology into the collective war machine. The enemy commanders believed they were witnessing the final destruction of human military power, and their hive mind communications buzzed with anticipation of complete victory. Dr. Elizabeth Carter watched the battle unfold from her command center deep beneath the Colorado mountains. Her instruments tracked the Nighthawk's progress through the enemy fleet, while other displays showed the positions of Vex command ships. The timing had to be perfect, or the mission would fail and humanity's last hope would be lost. Nighthawk is approaching the target zone, Carter announced to her team. All systems are showing green. The quantum disruption device is charged and ready for activation. The Nighthawk reached the center of the Vex formation, surrounded by dozens of massive bioships that pulsed with collective intelligence. Morgan could see the enemy flagship through his viewports, a monstrous vessel that served as the focal point for the entire hive mind network. The ship was so large that it had its own gravitational field, and smaller Vex vessels orbited around it like mechanical moons. "We're in position," Morgan reported to his crew. "Janet, prepare to activate the quantum pulse on my mark." Lewis made final adjustments to the Prometheus fire device, her hands steady despite the enormous pressure. The weapon had never been tested at full power, and there was no guarantee it would work as designed. But the theoretical models were sound, and humanity had no other options left. The battle around them intensified as more human ships engaged the enemy. The Vex bioships responded with devastating firepower, their organic weapons tearing through human shields and armor. But the human crews continued to fight, knowing that their sacrifice was buying time for the mission that would determine the fate of the galaxy. Turner's fighters swarmed around a massive Vex cruiser, their small weapons pecking at its hull while drawing its attention away from the stealth ship. The enemy vessel swatted at the human fighters like an angry beast, destroying several with each shot but unable to eliminate them all. The Vex fleet had formed exactly the configuration that humanity had hoped for. The bioships were clustered around their command vessels, their quantum networks operating at maximum efficiency to coordinate the final assault. The hive mind was fully engaged, Every unit connected to the collective consciousness that gave them their overwhelming tactical advantage. Initiating quantum pulse in 10 seconds, Lewis announced. All crew members prepare for immediate power loss after activation. Morgan watched the countdown display, knowing that everything depended on the next few moments. The enemy was celebrating. Their approaching victory? Their hive mind commanders already planning the conquest of Earth and the conversion of humanity into biomechanical slaves. 5 seconds, Lewis continued. 4, 3, 2, 1, activating now. The Prometheus fire device discharged its quantum pulse into the Vex network, sending a wave of disruption through the invisible connections that bound the enemy fleet together. For the first time in their species' history, the Vex were about to experience something that humans knew all too well, the terror of being truly alone. The pulse spread through the quantum entanglement network in microseconds, reaching every connected Vex unit simultaneously. The effect was immediate and devastating, as thousands of bioships suddenly found themselves cut off from the collective consciousness that had guided them since birth. At exactly 14:32 Earth Standard Time, the quantum pulse from the Prometheus fire device reached every corner of the Vex fleet. Captain Steve Morgan watched from the bridge of the Nighthawk as the massive bioships around them suddenly stopped their coordinated movements. For the first time in their species' existence, the Vex experienced the horror of disconnection from their collective consciousness. The effect was more devastating than Dr. Elizabeth Carter had dared to hope. Throughout the enemy fleet, individual Vex units found themselves alone in their own minds, cut off from the hive mind network that had guided every decision since birth. The biomechanical soldiers aboard the ships began to panic. Their organic and mechanical parts no longer working in harmony. On the bridge of his flagship, Admiral Kyle Morrison watched in amazement as the Vex formation began to collapse. Bioships that had moved with perfect coordination moments before now drifted aimlessly through space. Some vessels fired their weapons randomly, hitting anything that moved, including their own allies. Others simply shut down completely as their crews struggled to function without the collective guidance they had always known. The quantum pulse had torn through the Vex network like a virus, severing connections that had existed for thousands of years. Command ships that had controlled dozens of smaller vessels suddenly found themselves isolated, their captains unable to communicate with their own fleets. The hive mind that had made the Vex so dangerous was now their greatest weakness, but humanity's masterstroke went far beyond the quantum weapon. Every piece of human technology that the Vex had consumed over the past months contained hidden programs that activated the moment the pulse was transmitted. Mining equipment that had been incorporated into bioships suddenly overloaded, causing massive explosions deep within enemy hulls. Computer systems that had been absorbed into Vex networks began spreading viruses that corrupted essential data. Captain Ben Rodriguez, his ship the Defiant still fighting despite heavy damage, watched in wonder as a massive Vex cruiser tore itself apart from the inside. The enemy vessel had consumed human mining lasers during the conquest of Titan's Rest, and those same lasers were now firing uncontrolled bursts that cut through the ship's organic hull like a knife through flesh. The dormant programs that humanity had hidden in their abandoned technology were activating across the entire Vex fleet. Fusion reactors that had been taken from human colonies began to cascade toward meltdown. Quantum computers that had been integrated into enemy systems started broadcasting false data that confused and misdirected Vex units. The enemy's greatest advantage, their ability to adapt and incorporate conquered technology, had become their undoing. Colonel Amy Turner, leading her fighter squadrons through the chaos, couldn't believe what she was seeing. Vex bioships were turning their weapons on each other, their crews apparently unable to distinguish between friend and foe. The disciplined formation that had threatened to overwhelm Earth's defenses was dissolving into a chaotic free-for-all where no ship was safe from its neighbors. The spore clouds that had disabled so many galactic vessels suddenly began to dissipate. Without the hive mind coordination to maintain them, the biological weapons lost their cohesion and drifted harmlessly through space. Ships that had been trapped in the green mist found their power returning as the disruptive effect faded away. Dr. Carter monitored the battle from her underground command center, watching as her weapon exceeded every theoretical prediction. The quantum disruption had not only severed the Vex network, but had triggered a cascade failure that was spreading through their entire collective system. Bioships throughout the fleet were experiencing complete breakdowns as their organic and mechanical components fought against each other. Admiral Morrison seized the moment, broadcasting orders to all human forces. "All ships, press your attack," he commanded. "The enemy is in chaos. Show them what happens when they threaten humanity." The other galactic species, seeing the tide turn dramatically, emerged from their hiding places to join the counterattack. Kreth heavy cruisers that had been held in reserve opened fire with their particle cannons. Zephyrian interceptors swarmed over confused Vex vessels like angry insects. Even the cautious Nautilians brought their deep space vessels into the battle, their water-filled hulls protecting crews that had thought the war was lost. The battle that had seemed hopeless minutes before was now turning into a rout. Vex bioships that had been nearly invulnerable to conventional weapons were now easy targets, their adaptive defenses failing as their crews struggled with the trauma of sudden isolation. Ships that had fought with mechanical precision were now making basic tactical errors that any military academy student could exploit. Commander Lisa Hayes, monitoring the enemy communications from the Valiant, reported a complete breakdown in Vex command structure. "Admiral, their networks are completely disrupted," she said with barely contained excitement. "Individual units are requesting orders that their commanders can't give. Some ships are trying to retreat while others are still attacking their own allies." The Nighthawk, its power nearly exhausted from the quantum weapon discharge, drifted through the center of the enemy fleet as chaos erupted around them. Captain Morgan and his crew watched as bioships that had been hunting them moments before now ignored their presence completely, too focused on their own internal struggles to notice the small human vessel. Janet Lewis monitored the weapons effects from her station, amazed at the thoroughness of the disruption. "Captain, the quantum pulse has severed every connection in their network," she reported. "The Vex collective consciousness has been completely shattered." The battle raged for 6 more hours, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Vex collective, masters of biological warfare and technological adaptation, found themselves facing an enemy that fought harder when cornered. Human ships that had been retreating minutes before now pressed forward with renewed confidence, their crews eager to repay the enemy for months of devastating losses. The hidden programs in human technology continued to wreak havoc throughout the Vex fleet. Ships that had seemed indestructible began to break apart as their stolen components turned against them. The enemy had learned too late that humanity's gift for warfare extended beyond tactics and strategy, to include the art of turning an opponent's strengths into fatal weaknesses. As the last Vex bioship fell silent, its organic hull cooling in the vacuum of space, Dr. Carter allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The enemy had been celebrating their victory, planning their conquest, discussing the division of galactic territory as if the war was already won. They had made the fatal mistake of underestimating humanity's capacity for both sacrifice and innovation. The quantum weapon had worked exactly as designed, but its success depended on more than just advanced technology. It required the courage of Captain Morgan and his crew, the sacrifice of countless human colonies that had been turned into traps, and the stubborn refusal of humanity to surrender even when facing impossible odds. Admiral Morrison stood on the bridge of the Valiant, looking out at the debris field that had once been the most powerful fleet in galactic history. The Vex collective was finished, their hive mind consciousness destroyed and their bioships reduced to drifting hulks. The species that had threatened to consume the entire galaxy had been defeated by the newest members of the galactic community, the other species. Representatives would later record this battle as the moment when humanity truly proved itself worthy of leadership among the stars. The Galactic Council would rebuild stronger than before, with human tactical doctrine becoming the foundation for new defensive strategies. But for the humans who had fought and died in the defense of their worlds, it was simply what they had always done when their backs were against the wall. The enemy had been celebrating their approaching victory, dividing up conquered territory, and planning the conversion of entire civilizations. Now they were extinct, their threat eliminated by a species they had dismissed as primitive newcomers. Humanity stood ready to help rebuild the galaxy they had saved, but the message was clear. To any future threats, never underestimate the humans when they decide to fight.